My topic for the assessment in school counseling project was dyslexia and its social emotional effects. So I will be discussing the main themes from my literature review, which were the origins and signs of dyslexia, social emotional effects of dyslexia, as well as supports for students with dyslexia, including the assessments that we could be using for these social emotional effects. So I want anyone who's watching to just take a look at this screen for a second and see if they can read what it says. And if you're just seeing a bunch of letters that are sort of in gibberish and not really making sense to you, that's because that's exactly what it is. And this is just to sort of simulate what it might be like for someone with dyslexia, to take a look at an article online. And this might be what someone with dyslexia sees when they're trying to read something. So I want to talk about what dyslexia is first. Um, it is the most common learning disability and the most thoroughly researched learning disability of all of the learning disabilities, and affects 20% of people. So even if we're just working with kids, we want to think about how there are many, many adults that live and function with dyslexia. And specifically, dyslexia is difficulty with fluency in reading, decoding, which is unpacking the meaning of a word, and word recognition as well as spelling. So this presents itself often with people who may take a little bit longer to read something, or may flip letters around in a word, or even flip words around within a sentence. Dyslexia can be hereditary, but is caused by a structural difference in the brain. One side of the brain is a little bit bigger than the other side of the brain, and can be detected at a young age in children by the pediatrician, using some symptoms and some signs that can be identified early on in childhood development. Dyslexia is not more common for one gender or the other. A lot of folks think that it's more common for boys, but it is just more often reported for boys because of the rambunctious behavior that young boys often display when they are dyslexic and have a hard time focusing in school because of their dyslexia. Dyslexia is not caused by poverty or second language learning, speech or hearing impairments, or developmental delays. Like I said before, it's hereditary and it has to do with the development of the brain. Dyslexia is also not something that can be cured. It is remedied by developing coping strategies for reading. And it is not an indication of anyone's IQ or ability level. Plenty of folks who have PhDs are dyslexic. So when a student or a child has dyslexia, there are almost always negative social emotional effects that children display. And this can be seen through anxiety, performance anxiety, so presenting or reading out loud in front of their classmates, as well as testing anxiety, shortened attention span, which connects to low motivation there on the bottom. So if they are, not able to pay attention for a long period of time, that may result in low motivation in school, as well as low self-esteem if they're not performing at the same rate as their peers, and anger perhaps, or frustration with the way that dyslexia interferes with their learning. So some assessments that might be appropriate for students with dyslexia. I'm not going to include any sort of assessments that actually identify dyslexia, because we're going to assume that the student that we're working with has already been diagnosed with dyslexia by a special education teacher. So I chose the General Anxieties Disorder 7, the GAD-7, that could give us some present levels for their anxiety that may be presenting because of their dyslexia, as well as the Beck anxiety inventory as well, that gives some really good physical symptoms and outward things that a student may be feeling in a moment of test anxiety or performance anxiety. I also want to bring up that maybe we don't need to assess a student with dyslexia, given that they have anxiety around testing, that we don't want to do more harm than good in a situation where we're trying to support a student with dyslexia. perhaps instead of assessing these students, we can be consultants for teachers as far as giving more strategies for students with dyslexia to have more success in their classroom. So there are specific reading strategies like chunking, highlighting words, or chunking things into smaller sections, highlighting, and then basic work on phonics and sounding out words. Positive risk-taking, creating an environment in which taking a risk is a good thing and is celebrated so that they aren't afraid to speak out loud or read in front of their classes. Working with a special education teacher or a learning specialist in a small group or one-on-one on those specific reading strategies could help a student with dyslexia, as well as counseling to sort of talk about advocacy skills and ways they are coping with some of the negative social emotional side effects of dyslexia. So some connections I've made to our assessment course through my literature review and thinking more about students with dyslexia is one thing that came up in Hayes about the purpose of assessment being generating alternatives, right? So like I had said before, why is it that we would assess a student with dyslexia, given that they've already been diagnosed, that we're not necessarily the ones that are looking for the educational or the literacy skills, but rather the social emotional effects that dyslexia can have on a student. The second thing, the connection I made were perhaps it would be useful to make some behavioral observations and that a student may come to us because of a behavior issue. But upon further investigation, if they are struggling with reading or a learning disability, that knowing that could uncover some of the behaviors that we're seeing in class. And so being able to identify that to target the behaviors could be really helpful. As well as what I had said before, the idea of ethics and non-malfeasance. In a situation where a student has severe test anxiety, asking the question, is it actually really beneficial to give that student an assessment? What is the purpose of the assessment? And is it going to do more good than it is going to do harm? Something to consider.